My father took an axe to my mother's piano while I watched from the kitchen doorway, and he made sure I heard every string snap. I was 14 years old. The piano was older than me, a 1967 Steinway upright my mother had saved for 10 years to buy, the only thing in that house that was truly hers, that he'd never paid for, that he couldn't claim as his. She taught me on it, her hands guiding mine across the keys, showing me how Bach could be order and Chopin could be grief and jazz could be the sound of a woman who still knew how to laugh. She died 6 months earlier. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though she'd been healthy, though she'd been planning to leave, though I'd found her notebooks filled with bus schedules and apartment listings and a new name she'd chosen, Clara. Like the music. That afternoon, I'd come home from school to find my father in the living room. He was drunk, not unusual, but this was a different drunk. The kind where his hands shook and his eyes were wet and he looked at the piano like it was a person who'd betrayed him. He was holding his fire axe, the one from the garage, the one he kept sharp enough to split cordwood in a single swing. Your mother loved this thing more than she loved me, he said, not looking up from the keys. Sat here for hours, playing, dreaming, planning. He spat the last word like poison. Planning to leave, to take you, to become someone else. I didn't say anything. I'd learned not to say anything when he talked about my mother. Agreement made him nostalgic. Silence made him instructional. There was no right answer, only varying degrees of wrong that ended with his fist or his belt or the sound of something breaking that I couldn't fix. I tried to walk past him, to my room, to anywhere else. He blocked the doorway with the axe. She taught you to play, he said. Taught you her secrets. Her codes, her plans. He laughed, a wet, broken sound. You think I didn't know? You think I didn't read her notebooks? Clara, fucking Clara. Like she could just become someone else and I'd never find her. He raised the axe. I screamed. I ran for the piano, as if my body could shield wood and wire from steel, as if love could be armor, as if 14 years of lessons had taught me anything about protecting what mattered. He didn't hit me. That would have been too simple. He pushed me aside, one hand, casual, like brushing away a fly, and he swung. The first blow split the lid. Mahogany, polished by my mother's hands every Saturday, cracked like a bone. The strings sang, a discordant, dying chord that hung in the air like a scream. The second blow shattered the floorboard, the keys jumping like teeth knocked from a mouth. Black and ivory. My mother's fingerprints still visible on the sharps where she'd played Clair de Lune the night before she died, flying across the room like shrapnel. I screamed. I beat his back with my fists. He ignored me. He swung 7 more times, I counted. I still count sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. 1, 2, 3. At 4, the soundboard split. At 6, the strings began to snap, whipping through the air like angry wires, cutting his arm, drawing blood he didn't feel. At 9, the piano was a ruin, wood splintered, strings coiled like dead snakes, hammers broken and scattered across the carpet like discarded bones. He dropped the axe. He looked at me, he smiled. This is what happens, he said, when you put music before your family, when you hide secrets in keys and codes and chords. He wiped his forehead, leaving a smear of sawdust and blood. Your mother was a disobedient wife. Disobedient wives die. And their pianos die with them. He walked out, he went to his workshop. I heard the radio turn on talk radio, his favorite, the kind where angry men shouted about women who didn't know their place. I sat on the floor. I held a key middle C, the first note my mother had taught me, the center of everything, now jagged and splintered at the edges. It was still warm from the friction of the axe. I kept thinking, I knew it was broken, but I kept thinking that if I held it long enough, if I pressed it to my chest, if I whispered my mother's name enough times, the wood would knit back together, the strings would retune, the piano would rise from its ruin and play again. It didn't. I gathered the pieces. All night, while my father snored in his recliner, while the radio played static into the dark, I collected every splinter, every string, every hammer. I filled 3 garbage bags. I carried them to the shed behind the house, the one where he stored his tools and his pride and his secret bottles. I buried them under the workbench, in a hole I dug with a trowel, in dirt that smelled of oil and rust, and the particular loneliness of a place where nothing living was welcome. I placed the middle C on top, my offering, my marker, my promise. I scratched her name into the dirt with the trowel. Clara. And below that, because I was 14 and dramatic and heartbroken, she was still playing when he killed her. Then I made a promise. Not out loud. Just in the part of myself that my father hadn't smashed yet, the part that still believed in things like justice and restoration and the possibility of a world where music didn't end in splinters. I will come back for you, I promised my mother's ghost. I will come back, and I will build the piano he couldn't break, and he will never stop hearing it. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to have your love split with an axe while you beat against a back that won't turn. Maybe you know the particular horror of hearing strings snap that once played your mother's lullabies. Maybe you know what it's like to bury your heart in garbage bags under a workbench, swearing to the dirt that you will not forget. If that's you, subscribe. Not because I have comfort, because I have a trowel. And because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing in my father's workshop, watching him claw at his ears, while the piano he sold to a junk dealer played from the walls and waited for a note I never struck. Here's my story. I left at 18, not ran left. I won a scholarship to a conservatory 3 states away, a full ride for piano performance, based on a recording I'd made in the school music room on an instrument that wasn't broken. I became a piano technician, then a restorer, then one of the youngest Steinway-certified rebuilders in the country, specializing in instruments damaged by flood, fire, neglect, and violence. I was good at it, better than good. I understood pianos in a way I never understood people. Pianos were honest. Their damage was real, their restoration was real. Their music had to be earned every day. You couldn't force a piano to sing, not really, not the kind of singing that held through tempos and dynamics and the weight of a player's grief. You had to build trust. You had to become someone worth playing through. I worked in shops, in concert halls, in a program for instruments damaged in natural disasters, where I helped rebuild pianos that had been underwater, burned, crushed by falling trees, instruments that had survived what their owners hadn't, that held music like memory, that could be coaxed back to life with patience and skill, and the understanding that some wounds don't close, they just learn to resonate differently. I came home at 32 with a reputation, a scar on my palm from a string that had snapped during a rebuild, and a file full of restoration portfolios I didn't care about. My father was still alive. Still in the house, still drinking, though now it was vodka instead of whiskey, and the talk radio had been replaced by silence. The neighbors had complained about the noise, the shouting, the nights when he screamed at walls that wouldn't answer. He didn't call me. I didn't call him, but I watched. I hired a private investigator, a retired cop who specialized in estate disputes, who took my money and my story and sent me monthly reports. My father was failing. The house was in foreclosure. His liver was circling the drain. He'd had 3 DUIs, a suspended license, and a reputation in the county as a man who'd had bad luck with women. The euphemism that followed him like a shadow, that kept neighbors polite but distant, that meant no one helped when the roof leaked or the pipes froze. Then the investigator sent me something else. A lead. An estate sale record, the same auction house where he'd sold my mother's jewelry after her death, had a purchase from my father's account. 6 months earlier, one 1967 Steinway upright for parts, sold to a buyer whose address matched a known junk dealer, the kind who stripped instruments for brass and ivory and burned the rest. He'd done it again. Not to my mother's piano, that was long ash and splinter, but to some other instrument, some other music, some other woman's voice he'd wanted to silence. I drove to the house. I didn't call first. I didn't announce myself. I just parked in the driveway, the same driveway where my mother had once unloaded her piano from a borrowed truck, where she'd played her first note in this house while my father watched with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I knocked on the door that had once locked me out of the living room. My father opened it. He was smaller than I remembered, not just physically, though he was gaunt, his skin yellowed, his hands shaking, but in presence, in threat, in the ability to make me afraid, but I was still afraid. I felt it the moment I crossed the threshold. The living room where he'd smashed the piano. The shed where I'd buried the pieces. The workshop where his tools hung, where the axe still leaned in the corner, where the dirt under the workbench was still darker than the surrounding floor, still rich with what had been my mother's music. Melody, my father said. He'd named me for what he wanted to control. My little song, You've Come Home. Yes, I said, I have, I moved in. I told him I was between jobs, that I needed a place to stay. That I'd heard he was sick, that I wanted to help, that I forgave him, the lie I knew he wanted to hear, the one he'd been waiting for since the night he killed my mother's piano. He believed me. Of course he believed me. Narcissists always believe forgiveness is their due. They think cruelty is currency, and if they spend enough of it, eventually someone will pay them back with obedience. I explored the house while he slept. His room, unchanged, the same quilt, the same photos of himself younger and straighter and more dangerous, the same pistol in the nightstand drawer. The living room, where the piano's ghost still haunted the corner, where the carpet was still indented where the legs had stood, where the wall still bore the scar of a snapped string that had whipped across the plaster. The workshop where the axe hung, where the dirt was dark, where the air smelled of oil and rust and something else. Something like music trapped and dying, and the attic. Locked, but the key was in the junk drawer, the same drawer where he'd kept the axe. I climbed the stairs. I turned on the light. There were instruments. Violins cracked, guitars unstrung. A cello with its neck broken. And pianos, 3 of them uprights, their lids missing, their keys yellowed, their strings rusted. And on the wall, written in what looked like faded marker or something else, names, dates, Clara's Steinway, 2012, and before it, Margaret's Yamaha, 2008, Eliner's Wurlitzer, 2004, Diane's Baldwin, 2000, Susan's Kimball, 1996, 5 pianos, 5 women, I would later learn. 5 lives he'd tried to silence when they planned to leave, when they found their voices, when they played something he didn't control. But there was one instrument that was different. Covered with a sheet, pushed into the corner, dust-free, recent, within weeks. I pulled back the sheet. A 1967 Steinway upright, identical to my mother's. Same mahogany, same lines, same worn spot on the middle C where a woman's finger had pressed for years. Not my mother's, that was in the ground, but its twin, its shadow, its ghost made wood and wire. My father had bought it, the investigator's lead. The junk dealer hadn't stripped it, my father had kept it, hidden it, planned something. A replacement, a trophy, a way to finish what he'd started. I didn't take it. Not yet. I needed to be careful. I needed a plan. I needed to do what I'd promised my mother I would do, not just restore, but make my father understand. Make him feel what I'd felt. Make him hear music that wouldn't stop, that followed him, that played from walls and floors and the dark corners of his mind. I named her Resonance, because she carried what he'd tried to silence, because she was the echo of everything my mother had played, because she was the sound of what comes after violence, persistence, vibration, the note that continues even after the hammer strikes. I didn't keep Resonance in the house. That would have been too obvious, too risky. I rented a storage unit 10 miles away, paid cash, used a fake name, told the manager I was a musician between tours. I moved Resonance there. I set up a workshop, climate-controlled, with tools and tuning equipment and a recording setup. I spent my days at my father's house, playing the dutiful daughter, and my nights with Resonance, rebuilding what my father had tried to destroy. She was damaged, not just physically, though the junk dealer had begun the stripping, removing some strings, cracking the soundboard, but mentally. She flinched at loud noises, her loose strings buzzing like a scream. She wouldn't hold tuning, her pins slipping, her wood rejecting the tension that made music possible. She was a piano that had learned to be silent, that expected the axe, that didn't believe hands could mean gentleness. I rebuilt her, not into a weapon, into a witness. I repaired the soundboard, reglued the ribs, replaced the strings with new wire that sang instead of screamed. I voiced the hammers, shaping the felt until each note spoke with its own character, bright, dark, warm, cold. I regulated the action, adjusting the 1,000 tiny mechanisms that translated touch into tone, until my finger on a key produced exactly the sound I intended, no more, no less. And I taught her my father's frequency. I studied him. His habits, his schedule, his fears. I recorded his voice, the gravel and authority, the way he said my name, the way he'd said my mother's name. I analyzed the frequencies, the resonances, the specific pitches that made his jaw tighten and his hands shake. I tuned Resonance to respond to those frequencies, to amplify them, to send them back at him through walls and floors and the structure of the house. My father didn't know about Resonance. He thought I'd found a job. Finally, he said, some responsibility, and was spending my evenings at a repair shop in town. He didn't know I was rebuilding a 1967 Steinway upright to do what my mother's piano never could: survive him, outlast him, and make him afraid of music. I moved back into the house full-time. I played the devoted daughter, cooking his meals, managing his medications, listening to his stories, smiling at his jokes. And every night, I planted the seeds of his undoing. It started small. A note played from my phone, drifting through the heating vent, middle C, sustained, pure. He woke shouting. The piano, he muttered. The piano is back. Dreams, I said, bringing him water. Just dreams, then chords. Fragments of Clair de Lune played through a speaker hidden in the wall. My mother's favorite. The last piece she'd played. My father searched the house with a flashlight, checked the attic, checked the basement, found nothing. He started drinking earlier, sleeping less. Then the resonance. I installed transducers, vibration speakers, in the floor joists beneath his bedroom, connected to resonance in the storage unit 10 miles away. I played her through the night, low frequencies, subsonic, felt more than heard. The kind of vibration that makes your teeth ache, that settles in your chest, that feels like a heartbeat you can't escape. I played my mother's pieces. I played his frequency. I played silence, then sound, then silence again, unpredictable, unpatterned, impossible to habituate to. He started seeing pianos. Not resonance, I kept her away, but shadows that looked like uprights in the corners of rooms, shapes that disappeared when he turned his head, pairs of keys that reflected the porch light. I used reflective tape, cut into rectangles, placed at strategic heights. I used a laser pointer through the window, brief flashes of white that vanished before he could focus. "It's Clara," my father muttered one night, drunk, staring at the living room corner where my mother's piano had stood. "She's back." The little song sent her back. "Who's back?" I asked, innocent. "Clara, your mother, the piano, the one who," he stopped. Looked at me. His eyes were wet, yellowed, the eyes of a dying man seeing ghosts. "You don't remember, you were too young." "I remember everything," I said. He didn't hear me. He was looking past me into the dark, where nothing was there but the tape and the transducers and the faint vibration of a note that wouldn't stop. The nightmare started. My father woke screaming, shouting names not from his life but from the wall in the attic. Margaret, Eleanor, Diane, Susan, Clara, the women whose pianos he'd destroyed, the voices he'd tried to silence, the lives he'd ended. He'd wake drenched in sweat, reach for his pistol, find me standing in the doorway with a glass of water. "Bad dream." I'd ask, "Go to bed," he'd snap, but his hand shook, and he never went back to sleep. I replaced his sleeping pills with placebos. I encouraged his drinking, brought home bottles, poured his drinks, watched him sink deeper into the fog where the ghosts lived. I wanted him awake enough to hear, drunk enough to doubt, tired enough to break. It took 10 months. 10 months of rebuilding resonance, of planting evidence, of feeding paranoia, of being the perfect daughter while I dismantled my father's mind piece by piece. And then, the night before the anniversary of my mother's death, October 14th, I found the confession. It wasn't planned. My father, in a drunken stupor, had fallen in the workshop. He'd hit his head on the workbench, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to disorient. I helped him to bed. I sat with him while he drifted, muttering into the space between sleep and waking, and then he started talking. Not to me, to them, to the pianos, to my mother, to the ghosts he'd spent his life creating. "Clara," he whispered, "I'm sorry, I had to, she was turning on me, the music was turning her." I pulled out my phone. I started recording, and Margaret, he continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to, the pills, I just wanted her to sleep, to stop playing, to stop planning. She was going to leave me, she was going to take the girl. The notebooks, Margaret, why did you write them? Why did you have to remember?" He sobbed, a sound I'd never heard from him. Wet, broken, childish. "The pianos," he said, "the ones in the attic, I smashed them, all of them, to teach them that music is weakness, that nothing they love is safe, that I am the only thing that matters." He opened his eyes. He looked at me, but he didn't see me. He saw my mother, he saw Clara, he saw the accumulation of every cruelty he'd ever committed, standing in the doorway with a phone in its hand. "I'm sorry," he said, to me, to them, to the air. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I didn't accept his apology, I didn't speak. I just recorded and waited and watched him sink back into sleep with tears on his face that were too late, too small, too meaningless. I had what I needed, the confession, the names, the proof, but I didn't call the police. Not yet. The next night, October 14th, the anniversary, I made dinner. Steak, his favorite, potatoes, vodka. I let him drink, encouraged him, poured his glass full every time it emptied. I wore a dress the color of mahogany, I smiled. I listened to his stories, his memories, his justifications. After dinner, he went to the porch for a cigarette. I followed. The night was cold, clear, the stars sharp as broken glass. The woods were dark, silent, waiting. Lit a cigarette. He looked at the living room window, and he froze. Resonance was there, not hidden, not distant. 10 feet away, visible through the glass, standing where my mother's piano had stood. Her mahogany case, her open lid, her keys gleaming in the porch light, and on the music stand a single sheet, Clair de Lune in my mother's handwriting. My father dropped the cigarette. "Clara," he whispered, "No, no, you're dead, I smashed you." He turned to run. Stumbled. Fell against the railing. I didn't move, I just watched. Resonance didn't move either, she just sat and waited. She was tuned to do that, to hold, to resonate, to be present without playing until the key was struck. But I didn't strike the key. I never would. My father scrambled to his feet. He ran inside. He grabbed his pistol from the nightstand. He came back to the porch, waving it, screaming at the dark, at resonance, at the ghosts that weren't there. "Come on," he shouted. "Come on, you bitch, you want me. Come get me." Resonance didn't move, she just sat and waited. And hummed. A low, subsonic vibration from the transducers I'd installed beneath the floor, felt more than heard, the frequency of my father's own voice sent back at him. He fired. The shot went wild into the living room, shattering the window, destroying the glass that separated him from the piano that wasn't there. I'd projected her image. A hologram from a hidden projector that vanished when the bullet passed through. The neighbors called the police. I called them too, from the kitchen, my voice trembling, the perfect frightened daughter. "My father," I said, "he's having an episode. He's armed. Please hurry." They came with sirens. They found my father on the porch, pistol in hand, screaming at an empty room, urine running down his leg, his face purple, his eyes wild. They disarmed him. They cuffed him. They read him his rights while he babbled about pianos, about ghosts, about confessions he'd made to a daughter who didn't exist. I gave them my phone. The recording. The notebooks I'd found in the attic, my mother's journals, her own handwritten admissions, the bus schedules, the new name. The location of the instruments in the attic, marked with names and dates. The name of the junk dealer, who confirmed the purchases. The death certificate of my mother. The toxicology report I'd requested, the undigested pills in her stomach that had never been investigated. My father was arrested. Not for smashing my mother's piano, the statute of limitations on property damage had passed. Not for my mother's death, pneumonia, the original coroner had ruled, and proving otherwise would take years. But for the confessed fraud, the illegal disposal of instruments, the unregistered weapon, the threats to neighbors. Enough to hold him. Enough to start. He was evaluated by a court psychiatrist. Diagnosed with alcohol-induced dementia, paranoid psychosis, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Sent to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to see him in restraints, in a hospital gown, in the kind of locked room he'd built for my mother with his fear. But I visited once. 3 months after his commitment. He was smaller than I'd ever seen him. The axe was gone, the boots were gone. He was just an old man in a wheelchair, oxygen tube in his nose, staring at a wall. I sat across from him. I didn't speak. I just opened my hands and played middle C from a small keyboard I'd brought, the note clear and pure and sustained. My father heard it. His eyes widened. His mouth opened. No sound came out. "This is resonance," I said. "You sold her to a junk dealer. She lived, she learned. She chose to sing for me." I stood up. I walked to the door. The note continued, sustained by the keyboard's memory, playing from the speakers I'd hidden in my bag. "She doesn't need to attack you," I said, my hand on the door frame. "She just needs to exist, to be here, to be playing when you're not." I left. I didn't look back. I heard my father screaming as the orderlies restrained him, screaming about pianos, about music, about the daughter who'd brought the past into his present and made it sit and wait and resonate. I didn't keep the house. I sold it to a developer who demolished it, built apartments, planted a garden where the living room had been. I didn't visit the grave in the shed. I had the remains exhumed, my mother's piano pieces cremated, the ashes mixed with the varnish I used on Resonance's final coat, so that she carried my mother in her wood, in her finish, in her voice. I bought a building. A concert hall, small, intimate, with a stage and a studio and practice rooms that went on forever. I called it Clara's Resonance. Not a venue, a sanctuary, for musicians recovering from trauma, from abusive teachers, from relationships where their art had been used against them. We didn't train submission, we trained expression. We didn't break spirits, we healed voices. The logo was a piano key with a crack that glowed. The motto, we don't silence voices, we restore them. Resonance was the first instrument. She became the teacher, the piano who showed newcomers that music could be different, that hands could mean gentleness, that keys were for playing and not for punishment. She lived on that stage for 12 more years, played by hundreds of hands, heard by thousands of ears, her mahogany case growing warmer, her voice growing richer, her mother's ashes singing through every note. When she finally couldn't hold tuning anymore, when her soundboard grew too thin to resonate, I didn't burn her. I disassembled her carefully, saved her parts, used her wood to build new instruments, her strings to teach new technicians, her hammers to voice new pianos. She became not one instrument but many, her voice spreading, her resonance continuing, her mother's memory living in every note played by every hand that learned on what she'd become. I still play at dawn. Every morning, on the piano in my apartment, through the pieces my mother taught me, through the music I wrote for her, through the silence between notes that says what words cannot. And every time a new student, scarred, frightened, expecting the worst, places their hands on the keys and plays their first chord without flinching, who finds their voice in the resonance of wood and wire, who learns that music is not something done to them but something they do, I smile. Because the piano my father sold to a junk dealer to teach silence learned something better. She learned that music is not demanded, it is offered. That voice is not smashed into submission. It is built, day by day, choice by choice, until the instrument that was broken becomes the instrument that heals others. And my father, in his hospital room, still screams at shadows, still hears pianos in the corners, still waits for a chord that will never come, because the worst thing I could do to him was not violence, it was patience, it was presence. It was the simple, terrible fact of a piano who sang when he wanted her silent, who chose to play when he wanted her gone, who resonates in my memory forever, waiting, watching, and never stopping. I'm Melody. I'm 33 years old. I'm a daughter who buried her mother's piano with a trowel in the dark, who grew up to be the human Clara believed she could be, who learned that the opposite of cruelty is not kindness. It is consistency. It is showing up every day until the broken thing learns to sing again. If someone ever smashed what you loved to teach you silence, or if they made you bury your own voice in ground that was too hard to hear, drop a musical keyboard below. I read every single comment. And if this story made you want to play what protects you, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to restore? Backhand index pointing down.